No, I also have a question about these levels. Now, I have noticed, say, within myself, given where my awareness is centrally focused on at any given time, I find it actually affects my say perceptual capacity and the level of my perceptual capacity. And the only way that I can articulate it is to take the different chakras and to say if the lower chakras are activated and if my awareness is more or less locked there, then the whole the content of my in my mind is either filled with sex or food. Whereas when I'm able to shift it to the higher centers, then I find, like say, even my ability for creative thinking and to find solutions to problems that I'm faced with are far easier, and my level of understanding is much deeper and wider. So basically what I'm trying to say is that until I suppose you're somewhat stabilized, depending on what is going on, your level also seems to fluctuate.
Actually, we are talking now about the dynamics of connectivity. That is how you use it. And yes, now just as I mentioned some time ago, that there are certain things which have to be cleared up before you can actually build a connection with somebody. I just mentioned things like gender and sexuality. But there's a lot more that has to be cleared up, because you can't really connect with somebody with any degree of intensity before you have access to the energy that is required to do so. And unless you have cleared up your internal contradictions, conflicts, various impacts that you have had to bear in the course of your developmental process, and also the general impact of what we would call the primary formative processes as they prevail today, unless all these have been overcome, yes, I mean your entire internal dynamics, because our internal dynamics are not smooth and not necessarily focused and not necessarily under our, or we could say we don't necessarily have the capacity to guide our internal dynamics. So all these things have got to be smoothened out and sorted out before we can master the kind of energy that is required to build what we could call an energetic connection or even a mental connection with somebody else. Otherwise what we are going to end up building is some other kind of connection, which is not what we are really focused on right here. From a very practical perspective, what I'm increasingly beginning to see, of course within the limited geographical area to which I have access, is an increasing number of females in the age group of 20 to 26, maybe 28, who are beginning to be able to articulate this need for connectivity with as large as possible a number of people, specifically so that they can think together and talk together and better understand their situation and better realize their potential and what they can actually achieve in the course of their lives. And it is also interesting to note that there is a major gender balance in this area, and I hear complaints about this, and the complaints are to the effect that the men are only interested in sex, and that close relationships between women are considered lesbian, and therefore the kind of very close and intimate relationships that they want to build up are very difficult to construct and of course to sustain.
So when they try to build connections between themselves, they find this kind of problem, faced with this kind of problem.
When they try to build connections with people of the opposite sex, then they find that men are only interested in sex, not in connectivity, or let's say they're interested in physical connectivity, if you call it that. And when they try to build these kind of relationships with people of their own sex, then they are accused of being lesbians or homosexuals, and they don't feel comfortable with that as well, because that's not what the connectivity is all about. So there is a need to actually identify what this connectivity is, to talk about it, to bring it out into the open, and to point out that this is not something to do with sex, it's not something to do with reproduction, it's not something to do with living together, it's not something to do with couples, it's not something to do with companionship, it's not something to do with anything that has been before, it's something different. So we're going to have to win it recognition, and then allow it to grow up and develop its own kind of, what can we call, its own kind of configurations, its own structural framework, maybe even an institutional framework, but I doubt it, because this is a very flexible and a changing kind of a configuration. It's not necessary that you enter into connectivity with somebody and remain connected to that person for the rest of your life. So it's going to be a configuration that changes. So I don't know how the current institutional frameworks are going to accommodate that kind of mobility and flexibility. But certainly an infrastructure, I would expect an infrastructure to emerge where these kind of people could live in close proximity to each other and work together towards whatever goals they may have identified. To this question about people seeking to connect with the dead, that's actually at the moment a little beyond capacity to handle. It presupposes that people who die continue to exist in some form or another as coherent entities which are congruent with what they were when they were with us on this planet, and we are still by no means certain that that happens or that is happening. But if such a thing were in fact what is going on, then yes, connectivity with people who have died would also be possible. And since there is such a possibility, it is necessary to look into that. But right now we are caught up with the problems that we have in building this connectivity amongst the living. And these are very serious problems, because this kind of connectivity is very often misunderstood. It is to some extent feared. It brings a lot of anxiety, generates a lot of anxiety, and in fact could lead to very volatile situations and to people meeting with harm. And in order to avoid that kind of a situation developing, I mean, just to give you an idea of how bad it can be, it was not very long ago that witches were burnt, and wizards as well. So in order to avoid that kind of thing happening, I think it has to be identified, defined, brought out, discussed, and it has to be accommodated before something goes wrong.